The Australian Financial Review.
There were bizarre scenes on Queensland's Sunshine Coast beaches in March this year. The locals left their surfboards at home and they flocked down the beach with cordless vacuum cleaners. Big floods in the Brisbane River had flushed all sorts of rubbish downstream.
Another emergency is unfolding on the Brisbane River tonight.
Another boat has just collided with some already 20 pontoons.
Oh, it's going to hit.
And much of it was washed up on the Sunshine Coast, including some giant pontoons made of concrete and polystyrene. But worse was to come. The polystyrene started breaking down into millions of tiny particles. These beaches that are famous for being beautiful and white were suddenly whiter than normal for all the wrong reasons. The locals rushed down there with their vacuum cleaners, desperately trying to suck up all these tiny beads before they did more damage to the environment.
They called it a white army to come and remove the polystyrene. Now, if that's not testament to how bad the problem is becoming, I don't know what is.
That voice you just heard, that's Joanne Howarth. She wasn't on the beach that day, but from her humble warehouse in Sydney's western suburbs, she is on a mission to cure the world of its polystyrene addiction.
Hi, I'm Joanne Howarth. I'm the founder and CEO at Planet Protector Packaging. I'd like to share with you our sheer genius.
Everyone knows we need to do something about climate change, but what's not clear is how do we fix it?
Low emissions technologies.
There is net zero modelling.
Change is coming, whether you like it or not.
Change isn't just coming, it's already underway. We're living through a massive industrial revolution where just about everything we do is going to have to change in less than 3 decades. Empires are going to crumble and fortunes are going to be made. I'm Peter Kerr from the Carbon Challenge team at the Australian Financial Review, and this is Tech Zero. It's a podcast about the big green ideas that could get us to net zero and the inspiring people who are putting their heart and soul into making them work. Now, I would love to hear about your light bulb moment. Where were you? Who were you working for? What were you doing when the initial light bulb moment occurred for you to start this mission?
Okay, so it's almost 7 years ago now. My background is in food. Ever since I left university, I've worked in the food industry across all sorts of logistics, seafood, everything like that. And I had a contract to set up the operation for what is now Australia's largest meal kit. They were using polystyrene to ship all around the country. So as their warehouse operation and their outsourced partner, I used to receive all the meat, the seafood, the produce, everything would arrive in polystyrene. And then we'd receive more new polystyrene. We had B doubles queued in our driveway to deliver this polystyrene and a dedicated fleet of forklift drivers. And I really felt like I was single-handedly destroying the planet. There were so many practical issues. The volume of polystyrene that was moving through the warehouse was unsustainable as this business scaled. You know, it takes up so much space. And I had 6 forklift drivers, and it was their entire responsibility to manage the incoming and outgoing polystyrene. So it was horrendous. After 8 weeks of subscribing to this new meal kit, consumers had 8 polystyrene boxes and no way to discard them. So I was sick and tired of being abused and with demands that I come and collect these. And that's really what sent me on a journey to look for a sustainable alternative.
What's so bad about polystyrene? Well, for starters, most of the world's polystyrene starts as crude oil. So it's an offshoot of the fossil fuel industry. In recent times, we've seen some of the world's big oil companies come under pressure from shareholders about their role in making plastics. But there's other environmental problems too. Polystyrene is a connected chain of tiny beads called styrene monomers. When polystyrene breaks down, as it did on the beaches that day in Queensland, those tiny beads can infiltrate just about anywhere. The scientists tend to worry most about the potential for the tiny beads to get into waterways, be ingested by fish, birds, and ultimately become part of our food chain. That's why the folks on the Sunshine Coast were so desperate to vacuum up as many of the beads as they could. So you might be wondering, if it's so bad, why does anyone still use polystyrene in packaging? Well, for decades it's been damn good at its job. It's cheap, it's lightweight, it's strong enough to protect against bumps and knocks along the way, and it's also a great insulation material. Keeps hot things hot, cold things cold, and that's really important when you're moving food or pharmaceuticals from one place to another.
Polystyrene is a lot of air and a lot of fossil fuels. And so to get something that can offer the same thermal performance, and like when you're shipping things like chemotherapy or vaccines and everything, there's a lot of spoilage often when you haven't got the right insulation material.
So for 18 months, Joanne road tested every type of fibre she could get her hands on, from cotton to coconut and even funky stuff like pineapple fibres. She eventually found the solution in the wool that farmers were shearing off the sheep they bred for meat. This wool was just going to waste.
Until now, there's been no demand for that wool. So often, like sheep need to be shorn. When they're shorn, it yields between 1.5 and 3 kilos of wool. When I was recently down in Tasmania, I met so many sheep farmers that were sending this wool to landfill. They were burning it, which is terrible for the environment, and they were trying to find a way to dispose of it. And they often shared with me the fact that they sent it to the wool auction where it yielded very nominal fees. And by the time they paid the broker and all the fees, instead of receiving a cheque, they received an invoice. The wool we use is not textile grade. So historically, Australia has bred a lot of merino sheep. We're renowned all around the world for that. But as our population has changed, so too has the sheep population. And there's a lot more crossbred sheep like Dorpers and Awassi and different breeds. And these sheep originally were bred to withstand extremes of temperature. So their fleece is very coarse and wiry. It's what's called medullated. It has very good thermal properties. And this is the type of wool that performs best in our solution. So we were 18 months developing our proprietary blend, which is now patented, to ensure that the wool that we're using gives the best thermal performance. And one question that everybody always asks is there enough wool in the world to be able to support what you're doing? And the fact is, wool is renewable. So every year the sheep are shorn.
We'd always like to start up here just so we can explain to everyone the process of how we get the wool from the sheep's back.
Joanne's sustainability manager, Lars Lung, took my producer Lap and I for a tour around Joanne's warehouse in Silverwater, in Sydney's western suburbs. The wool arrives here in bales. The wool isn't that white wool that you're probably familiar with inside your Ugg boots. It's brown and much coarser.
Now, the reason that we don't have white wool, especially in this particular instance, is because we use the offcuts of the sheep, and we also use crossbred sheep, so not the beautiful pure merino that has that beautiful white coat, but we're looking for the sheep with a bit of variation in color that doesn't have as much value in the market. So that's why we end up with this much more organic look to it. And of course, we also look for shorter fibers as opposed to the long, beautiful long merinos that we are associated with, the wool industry. We look for much lower quality wool fibers. Once they've been cut into the appropriate size, we take them over to what we call our sealing machine. The sealing machine encases the wool in either a recyclable plastic or a home compostable plastic. Once they've been encased in the plastic, we put them onto our compression machine, which compresses the wool to 50% of its original size. We wrap it up in a high density plastic, and we are basically ready to ship.
The size can vary depending on the customer's needs or the shape of the object that it's protecting. But most of the ones we saw were about 1 metre long, 30 centimetres wide and about 2 centimetres deep. A bit like a doormat, really. They call these pouches wool pack. They put them inside the boxes that carry seafood or meat or vaccines from one place to another. And the thermal properties of the wool keep the temperature just right.
That one can go to about 70 degrees Celsius.
There's a room beneath Joanne's office with big ovens. She calls it the science of the lamb's room, and it's a crucial part of winning over a new customer. In this room, Joanne and Lars wrap the customer's product in wool pack and they separately wrap it in polystyrene. They cook both at the same time, at the same temperature in these ovens. It allows them to demonstrate how wool pack compares to the competition.
In Australia's harsh climate, you need to be able to get up to at least 50 degrees, maybe even up to 55, and with humidity up to almost 100%. So we need to test for all those different variables, and that's what we can do in these two different testing chambers.
It's slightly counterintuitive to the ordinary person, because when someone like me thinks about applying wool over the top of something, you're generally trying to keep it warm. You're trying to protect it from the cold.
Exactly.
But a lot of the time you're doing the reverse, aren't you? You're using wool to keep things cold and to stop them getting hot.
Keep in mind, insulation works the same either way. It's almost like a mirror. So if you can use insulation to keep something warm, say a thermos, you can also use the same thermos to keep things cold.
So it was absolutely critical that we design a product that matches polystyrene's performance. And in fact, that's what we've done. And in most cases, we thermally outperform polystyrene.
Australia's home to about 74 million sheep. If you do the math, that's about 3 sheep for each human. So you might think it'd be easy to source the waste wool with that many sheep, but it wasn't. As Joanne tried to set up her supply chain, she found one important part of the Australian wool industry had been totally hollowed out by the rise of China. The process of scouring. It's basically when the wool gets an industrial clean to take out the oil and the dirt and any other impurities that came from the paddock.
There are 2 wool scours still in the country, but these wool scours are scouring the beautiful merino wool that's going to the likes of Hugo Boss in Italy. So because we're using not inferior fibre, but a different type of fibre, they didn't want to scour our product because it would contaminate their line. 95% of Australia's wool clip goes to China to be scoured. We arranged a convoy over to China, and with textile experts, wool technologists, even translators. And we set up partnership with 2 mills in China with whom we work exclusively. But it's always been my mission to bring that home. We're a wool country. And so last year, in the middle of winter, I thought, I need to lobby the government. And it's really hard. We're a startup business with limited resources. Canberra's not listening. And so we started a change.org, and we called upon Canberra to bring wool processing back home. There's not any capability in this country to process wool. Anyway, we got 26,000 signatures, super excited. And we put this together with our application for the Modernising Manufacturing Grant, and we were successful, and we've won a grant of close to $5 million, which is going to be contributed towards setting up a wool processing facility down in Geelong in Victoria.
That Geelong scouring facility is expected to be up and running sometime in 2023. Until then, Joanne's going to have to rely on wool that goes all the way to China and back. For now, Joanne's wool pouches are more expensive than the polystyrene she's trying to disrupt. But Joanne reckons the true cost of polystyrene is much higher than it seems.
We are technically around about 10% more than polystyrene, that's all. But when you do the exercise and you factor in the volume of polystyrene and the warehouse space it takes to store it, and you look at what is the rent that's attributable to that warehouse space, there's more pallet movements, there's more freight costs, there's more labour costs to move the pallets, all of those things. So when you factor in those things, and a big one that a lot of people don't know about is polystyrene is highly flammable. It's deemed a dangerous good. So when businesses are paying their insurance, the insurance is loaded by as much as 45%, whereas wool is fire retardant. So there's insurance savings as well. So all of that brings the true cost down under the cost of polystyrene.
Customers are signing up at a rate of knots. Joanne won't reveal too many financial details, but she does hope to double revenue this year.
We have in excess of 300 active customers across all sectors, from fresh pet food, meat, seafood, dairy, chocolates, pharmaceuticals. Pharmaceuticals is a very big one. And because they use polystyrene because they need the thermal performance. And those industries are very highly regulated. And so they need to get a product that really performs to the same standard as polystyrene. And like our product, amazing, we're still in awe of the fact that it's being used in New Zealand for the vaccine rollout, for the COVID vaccines. We have really long-standing relationships with companies like Blackmores, who are an iconic Australian brand, and they do all the nutraceuticals, that sort of thing. We've had a 4-year relationship with Blackmores, and they just get what it's about.
Joanne knows that if she's going to replace polystyrene, she can't simply point to the fact that wool's a natural fibre. She has to live and breathe the low-carbon, circular economy mantra. That's part the reason she wants to scour the wool locally, rather than transport it back and forth to China. Scouring's an energy-intensive process, so the pressure to reduce emissions is going to come there too. Joanne's also determined to ensure that Woolpack does not become a single-use product that people just chuck away.
In New Zealand, we've very successfully set up a closed-loop recycling program with a very large client over there, so that when we drop off their meal box every week, we pick up the wool that was used in the previous box and it comes back to us and it goes through the whole process again. So, that's phenomenal. So we're not sending that wool to landfill.
Before you get completely swept away by the excitement of a disruptor like Joanne, I want you to stop and think about the people that she's going to disrupt. They've got businesses and jobs too. As we say in our opener, empires are going to crumble and fortunes are going to be made. After the break, we're going to put this question to Joanne.
Do you ever feel some sympathy for the businesses who you are ultimately trying to replace?
The Australian polystyrene industry employs close to 2,500 people, and it includes quite a few family businesses. They're finding it really hard to adjust to the government's 5-year plan to incrementally phase out the most harmful polystyrene products. For example, this year the bans will spread to polystyrene cups and those clamshell containers that hamburgers used to come in. Joanne reckons the government's plan doesn't go nearly far enough and is only ruling out the products that have already been removed from mainstream use.
I ask you, Pete, when was the last time somebody served you a coffee in a polystyrene cup?
It's a fair point. I don't reckon I've had one of those cups in 15 years. But the polystyrene manufacturers say the creeping nature of these bans is like death by 1,000 cuts. They reckon costs will rise dramatically for the polystyrene products we do need, like those in construction, if they can't make other stuff like cups on the side. I guess it's a bit like a butcher being told they can only sell eye fillet steak and they've got to throw away the rest of the cow.
So one of the interesting things as Australia and all countries navigate the energy transition, or the journey to net zero by 2050, and of course the associated things like developing circular economies and generally doing better things for the environment. There are a lot of industries that are going to have a really hard transition through that. And a lot of the time the narrative is about, we need to help these businesses transition. Do you ever feel some sympathy for the businesses who you are ultimately trying to replace?
I understand that they're big employers, they pay lots of taxes, they generate jobs, like all of those things. And, it's not like you can wipe out a whole industry overnight. But they should have seen that the way the world is operating, we're moving to a regenerative circular economy. And just like me, as a startup, is investing to stay ahead of the game, but they've been very complacent. And so some of these, the big chemical companies, they've just thought that they're on the gravy train forever.
Polystyrene is not the first industry to face disruption. Those that survive tend to disrupt themselves. Remember when Qantas created Jetstar to ensure it wasn't cut down by some new budget airline coming into Australia? And in case you haven't noticed, the big oil companies like Shell are investing heavily in the charging stations for electric vehicles. That's to make sure that they've got a seat at the table if petrol goes the way of the dinosaur.
They need to diversify. But I think the people that have been in the polystyrene have had it so good for so long, they haven't had that foresight. They thought it would last forever. And even when you read their projections, they're still expecting that their business is going to grow in double digits for the next 10 years.
The government's 5-year plan names a bunch of polystyrene products that are not being phased out, like the boxes that transport fresh food and pharmaceuticals, polystyrene for the construction industry, and those household meal delivery kits that inspired Joanne to start this journey in the first place.
And Australia is so far behind the rest of the world. The government is not driving this agenda. If the government won't legislate, then impose a tax on every polystyrene box that's going into the environment. Why are these companies filling their pockets at the cost of the environment? And when you talk to government, they say, we're waiting for businesses to, start the change. And when you talk to businesses, they say, we're waiting for the legislation. The government need to take ownership of this. We need to get up to speed with the rest of the world.
She'd love to see more ambitious policies to phase out polystyrene here and in New Zealand, but Joanne's already looking further afield.
Australia and New Zealand is only 1.3% of the global market for packaging. So for us to really accelerate our impact, we need to go overseas. You can't just stay here and make it happen. Asia is 46% of the market. And the first country that we've identified for our expansion is India. And we're just in the process of finalising our market entry feasibility, and we'll be in India by early next year. They manufacture 60% of the world's pharmaceuticals. So they need us to really sustain our expansion into Asia. We're working with Mongolia. They have 60 million sheep. More sheep than people, I think. And we've been working through the United Nations on a pilot program to see if we can upskill them to manufacture our product under license that we could then distribute into all of the Asian countries. We're looking for strategic partners who are going to support us. We're looking to raise 6 million, and we're looking for partners that are going to help us accelerate our growth. At the moment, we put a lot of our revenues back into R&D that's going to, generate future income. But we are very much a profit business, yes. There are good returns down the track, but we're wanting support to get to the next stage, if you like. That will enable us to expand our team. We're vertically integrating our supply chain, and we'll have the facility down in Victoria. And, it's to fulfill. It's like the nice end of the story that helps us just scale up and grow.
So the world wants to be net zero by 2050. What's your vision for your business in 2050?
I would like to think that by 2030, polystyrene is gone. It's a thing of the past. So 2050, I set myself very audacious goals. We have some big plans. I see that we'll be one of a number of players, but it's an enormous market, and it's an $18 billion global market. So whatever share of that market we have is pretty big. I've always been very passionate. I never believe that you can be successful unless you give it your all. And so I invest heavily. I really want my legacy to be that we've eliminated polystyrene and the world is better for it. If I were to give advice to anybody who's similarly coming into this space and wanting to change the world, it's like hang in there, because you need resilience and tenacity in bucket loads to survive those first few years. And fortunately, the momentum's building and the landscape has changed. I notice a huge difference from 5 years ago to even now. It's a gargantuan quest. Like, I'm on a mission to eliminate polystyrene, and I really will stop at nothing. I want that to be Planet Protector's legacy, so that future generations can enjoy the beautiful environment in which we're living.
Thanks for listening to Tech Zero. Join us next week when we chat to a solar power disruptor who's grabbed the attention of one very famous Australian billionaire. This podcast was hosted and written by me, Peter Kerr, produced and edited by Lap Fan, with technical production by Cormac Lally, artwork by Yerevan Delanchian, and executively produced by Fiona Buffini. At the Financial Review, we investigate the big stories about markets, business and power. For more, go to afr.com. And you can subscribe to the Financial Review, which is the daily habit of successful people, at afr.com/subscribe. If you want to get in touch with us, we would love to hear about your big green idea. So get in touch with us at techzero@afr.com.
The Australian Financial Review.